Go. See if this works. Welcome everyone to our Service Fabric Community Q&A 11. We're going to jump right in. You can start asking your questions in the chat window, and we'll try to get all of them answered during our session. Thanks for attending.
You guys can hear us, right?
Yeah, first of all, brief AV check. Oh, making sure that everybody can hear us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, we can.
Great.
Thanks.
High five. Yeah.
So job well done. Let's go home.
Yeah, we made it. The main video in the room appears to not be working, so you're only going to see the smiling faces of those of us who joined the call directly. We're all just sitting.
But I guarantee we're all here.
We're all here. This is everybody. Yeah. For those of us, hello.
This is Matt's laptop.
Yes, you're now streaming live from Matt Schneider's laptop. So hopefully there's some things that we can deal with. So I think we're just gonna dive in and start answering questions. So dump your questions into the chat window, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask us, and we'll be answering them as they come in.
All right.
And Marcin starts off with an oldie but a goodie. Silver durability. I think at this point,
what is going on?
The target is built. If Chaco were here, we would drag him directly into the conversation.
Yeah, the guy that knows the answer to that question is actually not here right now. But
now that you've said it, it's built.
Now that you said it was built,
I guess so.
You're cracking, Chaco.
Yeah.
I think that is the plan. I don't think that's changed. So probably no new news on that one.
Yeah. Okay. Status on the enhancement for local file-based logging. Enhancement for local file-based. Greg, if you could be a little bit more specific about what enhancements you're looking for. As far as I know, the main stuff is improvements to event source and event flow.
Yeah, and that might be exactly the answer. So we have now set up in Elk cluster, so we've got Elasticsearch set up, and we've set up included, obviously turned on event source, event flow, configured the source, configured the targets. So I had heard, I think it was about 3 meetings ago, that it was sort of on the radar, but maybe it was on the event flow radar to enhance event flow to be able to write to file also. Is that where that development would be done?
Deep and Carol, who are here, would be best to answer that. I think they're.
Carol listening.
Carol's working on it. I think he joined the other meeting temporarily, and
I'm
he's here.
Yeah.
Carol is awesome, by the way. I've been talking with Carol, and I am a very huge fan of Carol right now.
Seconded.
Yes.
We all like Carol very much here.
Awesome job.
Okay, I'm very humbled. Thank you. So currently, this is on the backlog, but I'm not actively, or nobody is actively working on local file support at the moment. If this is something that you really need sooner, please pick me offline. We can figure out something.
Yeah, well, what we're looking to do is we're now using, we're looking to sort of, we have local support currently, and I wouldn't use local unless for some reason my Elk stack went down. I had some sort of network connectivity just so I could fall back on local, because we're doing some telemetrics on it that's not related to Service Fabric, other applications. You and I have been working on getting the web application working, an older web application. So if I lose some of those statistics, it could hurt. But it's not pants on fire. I just wanted to check in on it. Okay, so it sounds like it's. Well, that's a lot of feedback. I guess I can send you an email, Carol, and just sort of coordinate with you on that. I didn't know if this was the right place to bring that up.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
And I think we lost the
room. I think they muted us because we were causing feedback, but we can't hear you guys now. You may want to unmute, and I'll mute myself again.
And it's here again. Can you folks hear us again?
Yay.
Yay, okay,
There
yeah.
we go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, we swear that this stuff is not built on us.
Man,
so-
we got video too.
Oh, we got video now. Look at that.
Hey, all right.
Unfortunately, we answered all the questions while we were muted.
Yeah, so there you go.
Ah.
Nice Q&A. We're done. Everybody go home.
Do we want to
okay.
use that scrolling thing then?
Where were we?
We were on API version in cluster
Right.
manifest.
Okay. So I was answering that, and that's when we found out you guys couldn't hear us. So as far as the API version goes, I think the one that you're referring to is present in the standalone as well as in when you stand up a cluster in Azure. You have to put the API version on it. We do use that to gate access to certain versions of. In Azure, it's mainly used around certain versions of the actual product API that can get deployed. It's not used for much these days, but probably more will become gated on that in the future. There have been a couple of times where a feature was only enabled for some preview version of the API or only lit up in some future version of the API. And so we use that as a check to see what version of the cluster we should be deploying and what type of access we should allow, how it should be set up by default, stuff like that. But that's its main use today.
All right. And Dimitri's got a question here about remoting. So when we override create service replica listeners, we can use one of two ways: return this dot create service remoting listener, or return a new fabric transport. And what is the difference? So the first one in that this dot create service remoting listener is just a convenience method, is all it is. Just a convenience method, so you don't have to know about the actual transport. And the reason we do that is at one point we switched the default transport underneath remoting away from WCF's net TCP to our own binary transport. And so this kind of makes it transparent for you. So the purpose of the second one is if you do that, you can actually choose what transport you want. So instead of fabric transport service remoting listener, you can also do WCF remoting transport listener. And then you can also configure it. So that's where you plug in all your configuration stuff is in that second one.
Yeah,
so,
that listener settings,
yeah,
you get access to it in the second one.
Yeah, so if you don't care, then just use the first one and we pick the default settings that we think are best. But if you do care, then number 2 is what you'd use. And then the second one, how do concurrent calls to a stateful service work? I have one issue with a one-core VM cannot serve 2 simultaneous calls. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're stateful or stateless, but the way the remoting stack works is it limits simultaneous connections to the number of cores on the machine, and that's per listener. So each remoting listener you create can only support the number of simultaneous connections equal to the number of cores on the machine. So it's really more about asynchrony than it is about concurrency. Yeah. So if you have a one-core VM, then you'll only see one simultaneous call per listener.
I believe that's configurable in the listener settings.
And that should be, yeah, that should be
it.
configurable. I don't know off the top of my head right now, but if you look in that number 2 where you say new fabric transport remoting listener, under listener settings there, you should be able to configure that concurrency level. So take a look at that. But yeah, by default, the behavior you're seeing is the intended one. Okay, now we got a couple questions on reverse proxy. So accessing a service by reverse proxy, and it's using this URL format. Is it possible to set a default service at my app? No, so that's not possible today. You have to specify which service in the application you want to talk to. So there's no default routing built into there. If you want default routing like that, or if you want to specify, basically it's what you're looking for is I want routing rules or URL mapping. So one URL maps to something else in the back end. If you want that kind of functionality, I would look to Azure API management, which has all that kind of stuff built in. And that's something we're working, again, on integrating that with Service Fabric a little bit. for encrypting transport over the wire. Again, that's in the Fabric settings. I believe there's a setting for that. So take a look at that. But it's not the same thing as the node-to-node security. Those are two separate layers of security.
A question on creation scale-up instances. Just Igor, as a question, I presume by scale-up, do you mean actually making the VM scale set like skew larger? I presume you mean scaling out, adding more VM instances. It takes 40 minutes. That's a long time. VM scale sets are not normally that slow to add machines. Sean, maybe do you know of anything that's going on there where scaling out a VM scale set would take 40 minutes? That's uncommon for them. That was one of the whole points of VM scale sets, is that it's usually much snappier. So some things to look at, right? You should look at kind of what's triggering that scale out, whether or not you're relying on Azure Autoscale or this is a manual API command or something like that. You also might look at manual action. Okay, so you manually pushed a button and added one instance to the VM scale set. It's usually a lot quicker than that. So there's not a lot that at Service Fabric's layer that is involved here. Most of the time we just wait for the VM to come up. It might also be worth looking at seeing if the VM is present in the VM scale set, and then making sure that there's not a huge delta between when it's visible in the VM scale set and when Service Fabric starts utilizing it. I wouldn't expect those times to be very divergent, but if the node itself is taking a long time to be provisioned by Azure, then unfortunately there's not a lot that Service Fabric can do directly, because that's a resource that we're waiting for it to show up before we can use it. If you do see it showing up and then we're not using it, then that's on Service Fabric, and we got to go take a look to see why we wouldn't be utilizing that machine. But yeah, 40 minutes, you're right, is awfully slow. So I would look at it from a VM instance provisioning speed. We've seen that be slow in regions that are very busy. So sometimes if there's just not a lot of the machine type, especially for the bigger machines, if there aren't a lot of them, then sometimes provisioning them can take longer. There's other things, quotas can get in the way that prevent machines from coming up in a timely manner, stuff like that. So I would go that route and then see what you find.
And you can either open a support ticket, or VM Scale Sets now has a GitHub issues repo as well.
Yeah.
Similar to the Service Fabric one. So maybe we can drop that.
So I would say that the way to look at it is, if once you deploy something, go to the resource group, see what resources show up.
Yeah.
And then if you see the VMSs, all instances have shown up, then typically what will happen is when you go back to your cluster, you will see that the state is not ready. And then over the course of another 5 to 10 minutes, you should see that going ready. If it takes longer than that, then that actually is a Service Fabric incident. Just let us know, because that would mean two things. One, either our extension, which is Service Fabric extension, is not behaving well, or the other one, which I've seen lots, is the Windows Added Diagnostic extension. So those are the two extensions which are always there 90% of the time in a given cluster deployment. So look at both of them. I think that will shortlist your reasoning for why it took 40 minutes.
Okay, hey, Chaco, as long as you're here.
Oh, sorry.
What's the news on silver durability?
So we're still striving to release it at build.
I committed you to build while you were
here. There's no striving anymore.
Yeah, that's what you got showing up late.
Yes, so that's what we are trying to do. The only reason why we are going slow about it is because what we are finding are there are some edge cases which may end up creating more incidents for you than you're used to today. But there are a lot of other great goodness about it, like the scale up, scale down, scale out, scale in. All those things would be easier when we have the silver durability.
All right, thanks, Jaco. So there's a question from Greg here. It says, is there a way to pause an application like we pause a node? So this one's interesting. You can't do that today. but I always wonder, so what does it mean to pause an application? So imagine if you're running a guest executable as a service. What would it mean to pause that guest executable? Does that mean to take it down and then bring it back up later? If you're using, if you're in our SDK, if you're using our APIs, it's possible that we could have a way of doing that. But basically that would mean shut down your listeners, I would presume.
Yeah.
Role change out of whatever you're running. We'd have to cancel your run async, kill the listeners, and then
leave it running.
But leave it running. So I'm curious what the use case is for this exactly. So in yours, Greg, in yours you say you're testing, test a web app if Service Fabric is down.
So what I'm doing is I have an external web app that's calling. What I'm setting up is something similar to like a Service Fabric version of Redis, creating a caching server, but I'm using the stateful service to store the cache. And so my external application is calling the Service Fabric application, and I need to test my external application when the Service Fabric application is down. So when my caching server app is down. Currently, I have to delete the app to make it down, or I could go and redeploy the web application with a bad URL or a bad endpoint or something like that. But currently, my only way of really bringing down this is to delete the web application from the cluster. And I could stop the nodes, or I can pause the nodes on the cluster, but I'm currently having other applications inside of the cluster. So if I do it at the node level, I kill all applications, where I just want to kill this one particular application so I can test my failover.
Have you, when you say one particular application, have you looked at maybe just deleting the particular service instance instead, or are there a lot of them?
I don't, when I'm looking at, and I'm using the Service Fabric Explorer, really, you delete the whole thing. I could go ahead and delete those. My assumption is, as I do that, because the redundancy, or it's going to detect that it's down and try to recreate it.
I mean, if you delete a service, that's an API call, and you told us to delete the service, and now the desired state is that service is deleted.
Yeah, it'll go down. The problem, I think, is if you're stateful, though, and you delete the service, you lose all the state. And maybe you don't want that. If it's a cache, maybe that's acceptable.
And I'm okay with losing the state, I guess. What I'm trying to do, I mean, that's my only option currently, is to delete and then redeploy the service. But I'm wondering if there's a way where if there's ever been a request to just sort of shut it down, like make it pause so I don't have to actually go through a deployment again.
Yeah, there's nothing in Service Fabric's layer. You'd have to put an API on the service that told it to temporarily stop its listeners and then start them back up again.
And deleting the service actually isn't the same thing, though, right? Because deleting a service, when you go and resolve the location of the service, if it's not there, you get a very different kind of error than if it is there but it's not responding.
Yeah, you get service not exists versus it's not responding in time, or something, timeout, right? Or whatever.
Exactly. So I think, I mean, for your use case, we don't. So there's no pause, but really, what a pause would do, if there was one, and you were a reliable service, what it would do is it would basically call close on your listeners, and it would cancel your run async. It would essentially do those two things.
Well, I've currently, because I'm calling this externally, I've currently got a web API front end to this. So I could really just shut down the web API and not allow it to get to the stateful service.
Yeah, you could. Okay. Oh, so those you're testing calls from the outside then, from outside the cluster. Yeah. Correct. Then you could do that. In that case, so that would simulate a situation where your application is completely not reachable. It's just
correct.
It's entirely down. Yeah. In that case, you could just kill the web API stateless layer, and you'll essentially get the same effect there.
How would I kill that layer? Just delete the EXEs? Is that what you're saying, or?
Oh, you would delete that service.
Mm-hmm. Again, that's what I'm trying to avoid.
Well, you have two services, right? You have a stateful service, which is your cache, and then you have a stateless web API in front of it that external users talk to, right? Is that what you have?
Uh-huh.
So you could delete the stateless service, and you don't lose any state that way, and then you can recreate it. So those are two simple commands. If you had a pause command, it would be one command that you'd run from PowerShell. Delete is the same thing. You run remove Service Fabric service as one PowerShell, and one PowerShell command that'll remove the service, but it's still registered in the cluster. So you don't need to do a full deployment because all the bits are still there. You're just saying stop running this instance, and we'll shut it down. but you're not actually removing all the binaries and everything from the cluster. They're still registered. And if you go look in SFX, you'll see the service type and the version, they're still available, and you can just click on create new. So I mean, it's actually not too different. For stateless, pausing isn't much different from deleting and recreating.
Yeah, they're about the same.
It's pretty much the same thing. I think it only really applies for stateful, where you'd want to preserve your state, but you want to shut down.
And we have
the
seen people
processes.
do that, especially when the
Okay.
service is going to be cold or down for a long time. We have seen people implement basically a pre-shutdown API that takes a backup of the state and stashes it somewhere. And then when they create the service again, they say, okay, this one, every single time it gets created, it's the first thing it's going to go do is check to see if it's got a backup. And if it is there, it will restore from that backup and then resume. So they've done that kind of external cold storage, remote storage thing as a way of not only shutting the service down, but getting its state out of the cluster, because frankly, state stored in Service Fabric clusters is rather expensive, right? You're paying compute VM prices for attached storage. And so when if you have a lot of these workloads and they're getting shut down and staying down for a long period of time, we've seen people go the backup and restore route. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. So just make sure I'm going to repeat back what you guys said. So I got it. Is I'm just going to delete service on my web my endpoint, my web API endpoint, and that will make it unreachable. It doesn't touch the cache, and then I create it again by hand.
Right, yeah. So this guy in the middle, if you can see the whiteboard, if you want to simulate the user can't talk to the whole system, you just delete this guy temporarily. Your state is still here. He's safe. He's okay. And then after you've tested this, you basically recreate this guy. And these are two commands, right? So there's the new service fabric service to recreate it. And then I think is it delete or remove? Yeah. And you remove SF service. And you basically just call, I did it in reverse order, but you call this guy first, call this guy second. And that's basically, for stateless, it's basically the same thing as pausing it. You get the same effect. You wouldn't do that for stateful because you lose your data, but for stateless it's really that simple. Yeah.
So being lazy, I could do that straight through the Explorer as long as I just deployed the same name.
You can, absolutely. And just use the same name.
Yeah.
And then for this, if you want to simulate, then there's a second one. If you want to simulate this part breaking, so then what you would do here is you'd actually have to build some code into the stateful. This is like your own API in here that you can call, which says, hey, shut down or stop processing requests. This isn't a service fabric thing. This is something you would build into your service to simulate that those two can't talk to each other.
And that could be just stop the listeners, so the listeners just start returning 404 for no reason, right? You just manually tell them to do that. It could be the full shutdown, dehydrate, externalize path as well. So either way is fine.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
The next question is, need an actor be a parent or a child or parent of another actor? I saved the reference of the child actor and the parent actor. Would we recommend this as a good practice? And then if reminders, would there be a performance hit with having millions of actors activate at certain time intervals? So the first thing is there's nothing wrong with keeping references to other actors around and then using that to track who to go call. For activating millions of actors all at once, you'd probably see some performance impact because that's the thundering herd, right? I mean, if you've got 1 million actors that are getting activated, each of those is a thread. So depending upon how many cores you have in the cluster, that might be a big deal or it might not be a big deal. Usually it's a big deal because that's a lot of state that needs to be hydrated if those actors were cold and had been GC'd. That's a lot of state that needs to be hydrated up from disk. And so that's a point of contention. And then all of them need to be allocated threads to go process that message, whatever that was. So that's another source of resources that can get consumed. Whether or not it's good or bad depends a little bit about how many resources you have in the cluster and what the kind of problem is that you're really trying to solve. One of the doing a simple calculation, change coordinates and deactivate. So a question usually that we ask when we see this type of architecture where you have a whole bunch of actors effectively doing the same thing is if those were all just rows in a dictionary, because remember that underneath the actors, that they are basically just rows in a dictionary. If they were all just rows in a dictionary, could you get away with one task that woke up and then swept over all of the rows and then went back to sleep for some time period, right? So instead of saying, I'm going to have an actor reminder that's going to fire every 5 seconds, that's going to go touch a million rows and then cause them all to do some computation, save their stuff, and return, could you get away with having, a million rows in a dictionary or 10 dictionaries, having a task that's going to loop over those rows and touch some or perform some update or some computation of them, and then do a task delay time span from seconds 10. If that's equivalent, then you get the same results with much less network I/O and with many fewer threads and resources consumed. I think that's something you might want to look at as another mechanism for solving the same problem, because it's much more efficient. And again, this really only matters, though, if you're willing to trade off that actor programming model, which a lot of people like, and if you're able to represent the calls that way, right? If you're sending different pieces of data to each actor, and you kind of have to have this kind of master controller, and you can't segment or shard that work, then it becomes a little bit trickier. But that's another approach that does address some of those resource contention concerns. Let's see what we got next. The scaling times I think we dealt with. Ian, question from Ian. We've struggled deploying our proof of concept apps to our local and cloud clusters using CLI. Service Fabric app package util has proved problematic. The support plan to be like for packaging and deploying without using Visual Studio or VSTS.
Tag. I'd like to know what problems you're having specifically with the app package util. If you maybe head over to our GitHub issues
list, yeah,
repo, I'd probably post that there if you're actually having problems with this, so we can take a look and help you with that. So deploying outside of Visual Studio or VSTS, I mean, we have to support that obviously because we are on Linux and we don't have the full Visual Studio experience there. So I think I would like to see a little bit more support for that as well. And I know that's coming on the Linux side, and so we'll see if we can improve that on the Windows side.
But it is coming
well.
on both sides. So
Yeah,
it's something which we're planning on.
Yeah.
And there will be an Azure CLI, and we're working on it. No, I mean, I don't want to talk about the dates at this point. So there would be an Azure CLI supporting the application packaging and also deployment of that. And also for cluster deployments, cluster creations, cluster rollover of certs, adding certs, all those things will be coming at this point, and we're working on it. So we don't have a specific ET I can give out at this point, but soon.
Soon is good. Okay.
Is there any priority to that? Is it high up or low down?
Price zero. It actually is price zero.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
that means important. In case anybody isn't aware of Microsoft's internal messed up priority scheme. saying it's got zero priority is actually that's an inversion. You flip all the way around. That's an underflow. You go all the way back to the most important thing.
Yeah. So there's active work on both fronts. So we're working on a ARM module for Service Fabric. So you would see that as well together coming up.
Great, thanks.
Is there a way to specify app-specific environment configuration at the SF cluster level? Right now, the only way I'm aware of is publish new config files with the service and make them specific to each environment. Yeah, that's really kind of the only way. Though when you say publish new config files, it depends on what you mean by that. If you're referring to the environment config and those profiles thing, like you would see in Visual Studio, those would be specific, and then you'd have to target you'd have to say what environment you're targeting. If you're saying, though, that you're dropping different settings.xml files or different files into your config packages, then there might be a different way that you could look at, which is to go the application parameters route. The way that would work is that you would you would have, you would have settings in your settings.xml which were marked as overridable, specifically must override, and then you would plumb those up into the application parameters, and then you would feed in different application parameters at the time that you're creating the new application instance. So if you know that you're targeting environment 1, you'd say, new Service Fabric application, then you get to feed in that hash map or that key value pair set of settings. So you'd say parameter 1, the value is this, parameter 2, the value is this. That's what the VS tooling is doing under the hood with those application parameters files and those environment configurations. But it saves you from having to go plunk down whole files in the config packages yourself if that's what you're doing. The question for the application parameters route is, where do those parameters come from, right? And so in Visual Studio, there's this environment config stuff where you say, here's an environment that I'd like to target, here's the parameters that I'd like to pass in. So those have to be stored somewhere. They would either be stored in those files, or they'd be stored in some script that made a decision about, if this script is targeting a deployment to environment 1, here's the parameter set. If it's targeting environment 2, here's this other parameter set. So it's kind of got to be somewhere. But that would save you from having to make a whole bunch of separate files.
Right. Okay. So basically, we can do that from the PowerShell script and actually pass it as parameters there, and that would work for us because we've got dozens of environments. Basically, we've got team-specific environments. So each team, rather than creating its own configuration file, they could actually just pass the parameters to the PowerShell script when deploying.
Yeah.
That's the intended way to do it. It's usually you wouldn't have application-specific configuration at the cluster level. The cluster is usually agnostic.
Yeah, the cluster is going to be shared.
It's shared, yeah. So what we have is application parameters which you can give to each application instance that you create either through PowerShell or C# or HTTP or whatever. So that's definitely the right way to go. And like Matt said, the Visual Studio tooling makes use of this with those environment-specific XML files. All those are doing is they're taking those parameters from XML and shoving them into that PowerShell command when they create the application instance. That's all it does.
New Service Fabric application. If you look at there's a thing called parameters, and that's a dictionary of parameter name to parameter value.
Yep, that's the one you want.
And then you'll punch that all the way down using configuration overrides into a settings.xml file. There's a few samples that show this pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have this in a couple of places. I think the IoT one does this. If you look at the IoT sample, this uses separate parameters. Yep. It's per tenant, but you can use it per environment as well.
And the health metrics data aggregation one also makes heavy use of that.
Yeah, that's right.
So those are some you could go take a look at.
Great, thank you.
No problem. Let's see. That was that one.
Port exhaustion.
Port exhaustion.
You're experiencing port exhaustion on our Service Fabric nodes. Every once in a while, cause the nodes to not respond. So the nodes don't respond. Have you seen Service Fabric causing port exhaustion in any of your installations? No. I mean, not to the point where the node itself is unresponsive. It may be that your services are unresponsive if you're using up a lot of ports there, but not actually the clustering layer.
Yeah.
We define specifically what ports we need for all the system services. And then we have the application port range, which is for your applications to use, but I don't think we ever run into port exhaustion at the system level.
It'd be good to know how your services transport and listeners are set up, because we have seen cases where a service has some bug or issue in its startup path where it keeps opening up ports, but not actually using them, and so they get allocated from the operating system to that listener, to that process, but not freed. And so if there's something like that going on, then you might exhaust the application port range, particularly if you're asking for a whole bunch of ports from Service Fabric using the endpoint definitions. You might run out of the application port range, which is a little bit smaller. I doubt you're really running out of the dynamic port range that Windows allocates, because that's pretty large. It's certainly possible, but not something that we've seen commonly. And it's usually because there's some other bug or issue or something's not set up quite correctly. So for example, we've seen port exhaustion where somebody goes to, some code goes and asks for an available port and gets nothing. In a case where somebody had misconfigured the port range down to like 10, And then after 10 services had started up, there were just no more ports left, and they stopped getting ports.
Yeah.
So that's one way to get port exhaustion, but I've never seen the actual port range, either the application range when properly defined or the dynamic port range on the machine be exhausted like that.
Yeah, to say the node is unresponsive is kind of weird. I mean, you should still be able to, for example, RDP into the node, right? So that port is still
Or
open.
ping it.
Or even just ping it. I mean, if you can RDP into it, I would just do that.
Yeah, no, we can't even RDP into the node at all.
That
Really?
sounds more like a resource
Interesting.
exhaustion problem or a firewall thing.
Yeah, that's strange. That's strange.
Open up an issue if you can't track it down, and we'll help you take a look at it. But yeah, there's nothing that we know of that would cause that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. How far away is the APIM integration?
Okay, so APIM integration. So it's actively being developed now. We want to have all the pieces in place to be able to do this by build, or maybe just slightly after build. So keep an eye out for it.
Build a Microsoft conference in the
Yes.
middle of
The build conference in
May
May.
10th.
May 10th. Yeah.
Yes. The build conference in May 10th to May 12th, I think.
Yes.
Round in there.
Right around that time, we hope to have at least all the pieces in place, and if not, shortly after. So keep an eye out for that. At that point, you should be able to set it up through a few manual steps, and then beyond that, we're going to work on actually creating a more, better experience going through the portal and setting it up with a few button clicks. But yeah, keep an eye out for it in the next month or two.
And I don't know of any preview programs we have for that one. I think it's just going to light up.
It
But
should just light up. Yeah.
once it does, feedback accepted.
Yeah. Any chance of around actor service dot exists? Yep, virtual actors. Yeah.
Yeah.
Technical reason why the only interface for getting existing actors is enumeration. No technical reason. It's just a matter of we don't want to violate the model, the virtual model.
Yeah.
Then we kind of lose the model itself. So no actor exists. It's something that you can do. I mean, I think enumeration would probably be the only way.
The most common thing we see is people just build another service that has a dictionary inside it that has the actors that have ever been created, the actors that it's ever addressed. And then if you need to find out how many actors you created or what their names are or whatever, you go ask that manager service and get a response back from that rather than trying to figure it out from the actor services themselves. That is 95% of the solution that we've seen.
The only reason why I didn't go that route is because doing backups, and if they get out of sync, because backups happen every hour, and then synchronizing across. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. The inconsistency question is another concern. So we would typically say that maybe that manager one, if that's super critical, you'd run it with more replicas. You'd span it across a range of machines that you're pretty sure aren't going to fail, so that you always have a correct view of the actors that have been created. You might also have actors that exist periodically report back to that manager, so that if the manager lost track of them somehow, that self-reporting would make them aware. So you'd put a reminder on for a month or something, right? And then no matter what, if a month goes by and something got out of whack, that actor fires back up, reports back to the manager and says, "Hey, I'm here," and the manager says, "I forgot that you existed," and goes and figures out whether or not it should be deleted or not. So you never really lose track of everything. But it's just that pattern of the manager is pretty common.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Availability zone support. I name you.
So,
what are these availability zones that you refer to?
So at this point, we're trying to have a safe way to span availability zones. Basically the reason you're asking this is because in a way you're asking when will Service Fabric support large VMSs? That's your real question. So today, given that we have problems with fault domains that are not compatible, we are not supporting any VMSs which spans AZs. So Shortly, we might come out with a workaround where you actually can choose to be across availability zones. Basically, a cluster will span availability zones using multiple VMSs, and that's what we would end up doing. We are talking to the compute resource provider's internal team, which is responsible for the VMSs itself, to give us some guarantees. The guarantees being that when they give us FDs for a given VM, we can trust it. So today, when it spans greater than 1 AZs, we cannot trust it, and so that's why we don't support it. So it is something which we are actively working on. So you would hear from us pretty soon.
Okay. Next.
Next question. So in Web API Service Fabric app, we don't have service context when running the middleware layer. And currently we're using Tiny IOC. And are there any plans to make this part of Service Fabric or something like it? So we don't have a plan to integrate with any specific IOC container. What we recommend doing is if you're doing ASP.NET Core, and we do recommend using ASP.NET Core over Web API 2 with Katana these days. So ASP.NET Core has dependency injection built in, and they have their own IOC container built in too. So that's the recommended way to do it. If you can plug in, service context, and actually I think our ASP.NET Core project templates already do this for you. They plug in the service context into their dependency injection system, and then you can access that from anywhere in your application, I believe, including middleware. So I would say take a look at that, or continue using Tiny IOC if that's working for you too. A lot of people just bring in their own IOC containers, and that works just fine. We have a hard time picking one because whatever we pick is wrong for half the people out there.
Or wrong 6 months later.
Sense.
Yeah, wrong 6 months later.
Exactly, it's going to change so much. Okay, thank you.
It changes so much. We have a couple examples that use Unity, and we get a lot of flack for that because Unity is not cool anymore.
Not sexy anymore.
But but I mean, it does the same thing, right? It's the same idea. So there are a couple examples out there you can look at using Unity, but it sounds like you've got that figured out with Tiny IOC already.
Yeah, it's working.
Sorry, you do have it working.
Yeah, it's working. I was just wondering.
Keep doing it.
I don't like to use third parties either. So if .NET Core has got it intrinsic, then unfortunately I'm too far down the path of building the endpoint service as a web API instead of .NET Core. So I'm going to stick with what I got.
Okay, do take another look at ASP.NET Core. You don't actually have to switch to .NET Core. You can keep doing full .NET Framework. That's actually the only thing we support anyways. And it's similar enough. They didn't make a lot of changes from Web API. It's similar enough that it's not too much trouble actually to go from Web API 2 to ASP.NET Core. And you're still full .NET Framework and everything else. So maybe take another look at it, see if that works for you. I get if you're pretty far down, it's hard to make a switch, but it might be beneficial to you in the long run. And they've got a pretty good dependency injection system just built in, so that'll get rid of your third party.
Give it a shot.
Give it a shot.
Okay, thank you.
We were told that we have an application gateway routing traffic directly to our services, but without going through the SF reverse proxy. We don't want to go through the SF reverse proxy since it exposes everything. Not sure how to handle scale, hooking up the scale set to the app gateway. I think there are...
Yeah, I remember this one. Yeah, so
we have an example somewhere, but I don't know where. We've done this a couple of times, but I don't know that we published it.
Yeah, I don't remember the details of this. I remember this though. There was a problem with application gateway recognizing new VMs as they get added to a skill set.
Yeah.
And I unfortunately don't know the solution to that.
Because it was programmed with the IP set or something like that.
No. I can.
So it's a follow-up item.
Yeah, we can follow up. I have a contact here that works on application gateway that might be able to help with that. So follow up with us.
Yeah, and if you can't get it working, do post a thing on our issues. We try and keep an eye on those and make sure that we're pushing those up hills so we can figure out a design that'll work.
Yeah.
Do we have some documentation for getting CI on VSTS specifically for ASP.NET Core? Default CI template results in build failure when we can build locally in 2017. I know that they did update the agents just recently to be basically 2017 agents, so I don't know if that would still be broken for you. It'd be good to know exactly what is busted so that we can figure out maybe more about where the problem is.
Is it calling the .NET utility that fails? I remember that was a problem, but I thought that was sorted out.
Yeah.
But if not, we can follow up on that one too.
Okay, so I'll probably just do a posting then in the forum and just follow up on that. It's just that when we're sort of compiling and publishing from Visual Studio 2017, everything goes great to our Service Fabric cluster online. But when we try and set up the continuous integration using the Service Fabric templates that come through, it isn't doing the .NET build. I threw one of those build steps in, still not getting it to work really well. So I'm just not sure how to mimic the steps
I remember
that
something about this, but I
2017
don't
is doing
remember
when it does the publish. So I was just wondering if perhaps other guys have sort of come across this or solved this. I can just follow what they're doing.
Open up there, and we'll grab Mikael, who's one of the guys who works on the tools, and we'll.
This does sound very familiar. Though. I remember there was an additional task I think that we had to publish specifically to run the .NET utility to restore and build .NET Core. Post an issue on GitHub, and we'll follow up with you.
Or search there. I almost feel like I've seen this before, but
yeah,
check it out. And if you don't find anything that looks familiar or similar, open up a new one, and we'll get the guys involved.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
No problem. Yep. Do you have a plan for supporting Windows Server 2016 Nano?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
It's in the works.
Yes.
Yeah, I answered that question.
No.
We don't have any.
Oh, you answered a comment.
Oh,
Yeah.
out of order.
Skipped ahead.
Yeah. Service Fabric events planned around build. I don't know that we have any Service Fabric specific things.
Specific to us.
I don't believe there's anything
There's
coming
a good
up.
place
No,
to
but-
drink beer close to the convention center.
Yeah.
All right, we'll be there.
Yeah, we might have a few unofficial events.
So there's nothing formally planned for that Monday, but Sander, if you'll private message me on Yammer, we'll see if we can.
We'll find some time.
We'll find some time, maybe. I don't know.
Then next on the roadmap, we're talking about restoring state to a stateful service is created. Where could the trigger point be? In on-activated sync. Yeah, that would be one place that you could put it, though.
Wait,
it's,
on activate.
It's more. It's on open.
On activate. Are you an actor service?
That's an
then?
actor service.
Yeah, that would be different, right? Restoring the state. If you're using backup and restore, then it's
already there.
Yeah, it's a different trigger point. If you're
Right.
doing it manually, though.
On activated sync or on
Okay.
deactivated sync is where you store the individual actor.
So that's the thing. If you're doing it per actor, then yeah, on activate is going to be the right place to do it.
Yeah.
If you're doing it per service, then you drop down to the service level, and there's an open async, or probably in run async actually may be a good place to do it because you don't have write access yet in open. So probably on run async, but activate async is fine if you're doing actors though.
Regarding the herd, yeah, I mean, we do have some throttling, so we don't completely blow up the box, but that doesn't mean that whatever those actors are doing won't get DOSed by them. So we might prevent the local machine from, say they're all doing that backup and restore that we just talked about. Even if we're waking them up relatively slowly, it might still consume too many resources or DOS some other remote thing. It's just something to be aware of.
We don't have our own thread pool though, so it's just the .NET
Standard
thread
throttle.
pool. So just using .NET tasks is all it is. It's just if you have a lot of them running concurrently, then that'll cause some problems.
Nick asks, is there any chance of seeing some of the magic from Reactor? CloudRx, Bart. Yeah, Bart's a really smart guy, and I wish we could get more of his code and just throw it out there.
Yeah.
I don't know of anything coming around that at this time, but that does involve that does influence a lot of our thinking about future programming models.
Yes, it does.
During the last Q&A, I asked about accessing actors through HTTP. No plans for calling over the answer on GitHub is that it's on the roadmap. Well, then we'll go take it up with Whipple.
Yes.
That's maybe because of the feedback that you gave last time, he's decided to take that on. But there's nothing.
We don't have anything short term.
Yeah, I don't think it's a short term thing at this point.
He may have put it on our backlog at this point for something longer term, but I don't see that in our short term roadmap now.
Yep. Reusing services across applications. Start control such. App contains service 1, app 2 contains service 3. Yeah, I mean, really, there's two different layers of organization, right? There's the physical resources in terms of the binaries and DLLs and service types and all that stuff. Service packages are reusable. You can pick up a service package and use it in multiple Service Fabric applications, which looks like how you've organized the stuff there. So that's a perfectly reasonable way to do it. And then that service type would be available in both of those application types. So that makes sense. Would you recommend using a load balancer and application gateway side by side for the same cluster? Load balancer for the internal traffic and application gateway for the external traffic.
I don't know about so the load balancer for internal traffic is kind of a tricky one.
I'd say no for that part.
Well, not between nodes in the same
cluster
VM scale set. So that actually won't work. So the internal load balancer doesn't support going from one of the node pools or one of the nodes in the pool for that balancer, the load balancer going out to the load balancer and then back into the same pool. That won't work because if it happens to come back to the same node, that won't work. It won't be able to connect. So
if you end up talking to something through the internal load balancer back to something that is on the same node, the load balancer rejects that connection.
Yeah.
Because from its perspective, you're just trying to connect to yourself.
You have to have two different scale sets or two different pools. You can go between them and have an internal load balancer between them.
But at that point, I would say just communicate directly.
I would just say communicate directly for that.
So Suri, are you trying to use two NICs on every VM? What are you trying to do?
No, sorry. So it's just, can you hear me, actually?
Yes.
The point of it is we're still very early in our journey and going through the design phase. And it's like, we're quite unsure, or I'm unsure as to when you would use a gateway or a load balancer, whether the application gateway actually does everything the load balancer does in a layer 7 portion of that, and it can manage the cluster as well, or would you separate that out from a management and an application point of view for if you have external traffic coming in?
I would almost say this is more opinion, and it will depend upon the actual architecture of the overall application. But I would say that an application type of gateway for traffic coming from the outside world, inbound traffic, I would route that through an application gateway of some sort. But then for internal traffic, I would just use resolution and communicate directly. That is the simplest overall architecture, and that just alleviates some of these problems where you'd see where internal load balancers have certain limitations. You're adding extra hops if you're transiting all the way back out through the app gateway, things like that. Things that will change that answer are issues like security, auditing, traffic management, things like that you want to have some other service in the route for. We'll put one of those additional hops in the path. But the simplest, most direct thing is a app gateway of some sort, whether it's your own that you wrote, something fronted by the Azure Load Balancer, event hubs, Azure API management, whatever, for managing traffic coming into the cluster. And then once you're inside the cluster, if service A wants to talk to service B, it resolves it next directly IP to IP.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend not going with back out. You're going to have some issues in terms of latencies and stuff, unless there's a real reason why, like Matt talked about.
Okay, thank you very much.
To Nick and Greg, there's no first-class thing other than Haishi's thing for directly sharing things in between stuff. The ad service reference stuff is starting to get there, but really there's two levels of things that you're interested in, right? And mainly it's by sharing service packages between application packages is how we think about achieving this.
AutoFac rocks. I agree.
Overriding this setting based on the article doesn't seem to work. I think that there was a bug, Greg, where that setting, when set on its own, would not take effect. But that should be addressed in recent releases. Otherwise, we'll just go take a look at the ticket.
Okay, thanks.
We're running out of time here, so let's see how many of these we can get through.
Tooling for querying and managing stateful service data in a reliable collection. I believe that is something that's planned.
We're working on a viewer and then a editor of sorts for that persisted data. I don't have a strong timeline for when that would show up yet, but that is something that we know we need to go build, and that is being built.
Let's see. So Nick says, "Oh, that's right. Pick the hosted VS 2017 default agent queue under options." Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
I knew there was something in there. I just couldn't remember where it was.
Once they got the VS 2017 agents present, I think it pretty much all kicks in, but sometimes not.
I mean, most of those .NET Core build issues they had in VS 2015 have been fixed in 2017 by throwing a lot of that stuff away and going back to the way it was before. Okay.
I like that you guys are just answering your own questions here. By the time we get to them,
Do you want to read the question out?
Empowering.
Yeah,
like
this is great. That's community for you. That's what we want. Are config package objects cached in memory?
Config package objects.
You can call it pretty rapidly. I think we do cache it, but only within the context of the activation context. So if you're getting a new activation context every single time, I don't know if we cache it, if we cache that thing.
Did you say within the context of an activation context?
That was a phrase that just came out of my mouth, yeah.
In a service fabric service.
In a service fabric service,
Got it.
yeah. We're great. Microsoft is great at naming things, guys. We're the best.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's at the context level. So if you hang on to that, I'm pretty sure we keep stuff. Otherwise, I don't think we do.
But I mean, how rapidly are you talking here? Because even if it's cached, if you're doing it that rapidly, you're still doing a hash table lookup.
Yeah.
So if you're that worried about it, I would probably just put in a local variable.
But then you have to be very careful when you do updates.
Oh yeah, just when you upgrade it, restart your process.
Yeah, just restart the process, and that's the simplest way.
If you use the event when you get a package update, you can use that, but it's tricky. I always lean towards just let the process restart. Do a forced restart when you do the upgrade.
Yeah, it'll be quick.
Package upgrade. Then you don't have to worry about it.
When you guys say it's tricky, because we're using the events to update at the moment.
So if you've got in-memory cached versions of things, you need to make sure that those get updated, right? So that you're not using an old version here and a new version here. If you're reading multiple configuration settings that need to be in sync in order to make sense, so like setting A is going to refer to something in setting B, you have to make sure that you don't read setting A, experience an update, and then read setting B, because now they might be torn. So you need to lock or synchronize the config package object that you get back.
Right. I mean, the APIs are straightforward. It's just, how do you know someone isn't holding a local reference to a config somewhere in code that you didn't write, and then when you take this, you consume this event, maybe they are not updating or something like that.
And so
you can get weird consistency.
And the way you write the code is every single time you go reference the config package, which makes every single line that references any config setting about yay long.
Mm-hmm.
So it's doable, but your code ends up a little bit more complicated and ugly. And so we kind of just say, a lot of times, unless you're doing lots of config updates and you need that performance of the process not going up and down, just restart the process. Use the force restart flag on the upgrade change, and everything will work.
And this will be nicer too in our next release coming around the Microsoft Build Conference in May 10th to 12th. You can host service instances and replicas in individual processes. So killing a process then doesn't become
much less disruptive.
Yeah, it doesn't become as disruptive. So right now you might have 100 service instances in the same process, and you don't want to tear them all down when you get a config update or something like that. So per process will be a little better. So it'll be easier to just take down a process and bring it back up, and that's very, very clean to do it that way. Okay,
last two questions, and I think we're going to have to wrap it up for this week. Last time I suggested not using default services. How does this work with release management, using PowerShell scripts to deploy or create services? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there has to be, today, unfortunately, Service Fabric doesn't have a real declarative service or application instance format. Even default services don't actually define an application anywhere. That's just magic that VS is doing for you on your behalf. So if you wanted to set, say, the maximum number of nodes that the application could run on, or using the application capacity stuff, you're going to have to write some scripts or modify some stuff anyway. So lacking that default service or that service creation declaration format, you get to choose your own. Positive. Downside is you have to choose your own. I like Notepad and PowerShell, and then I can read the lines out of my Notepad file, text file, and fire off a whole bunch of new Service Fabric service calls in response to that.
PowerShell commands.
Yeah, PowerShell commands. But you got to store the definition of what you want to create. So you could just put it directly in the PowerShell file as well and check that in. But that's the main mechanism that we'd recommend. That really gives you the control. It also helps you decide, when do you want to blow away the service and create a new one? When do you want to upgrade it? When do you want to update it, which is something else, right? All of that becomes very granular and very clear about when you're doing what. I think that's it. All right. And there, no problem. Thank you, Nick. Thank you guys all, everybody for coming. We always love these things. If there's any, come to build.
Yes.
Hopefully we'll see you there. If we don't, we'll see you on the issues list and Stack Overflow, and see
Next
you
month.
next month at the next
month.
the next community meeting.
May 18th.
May 18th.
There it
Very
is.
good.
Cool. Yeah.
Okay.
Stop by, say hi at our booth at Build if you're heading this way.
Yep, we'll be there.
We'll be there.
All right.
Cool. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
There's that button. And
Click all.